Okay, this is the part 3 of the first week lecture on biological classification. And biological classification is a way of organizing and categorizing a very complex set of biological information into usable forms. And you see in front of you what's called the classification pyramid. In the classification pyramid, these all look very similar. Sometimes you'll see an additional category above kingdom, where we separate prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms, but we'll talk about that in just a second. But most biological classifications have these 7 parts. I expect you to know these 7 parts in order. So you need to memorize this classification system. It starts with the kingdom. Kingdoms can either be plant or animal. And once you say that something's an animal, you see that you've separated everything else. Now, some people use a 3 kingdom. Some people use even a 5 kingdom, which we can talk about in class. It's sort of interesting how those things come about. But for the sake of most situations, a two kingdom plant versus animal is reasonably effective. Once you've gone from kingdom, then you go to phylum, and phylum is chordata, means having a backbone, and the achordata means not having a backbone, or not backbone. It should better said notochord as opposed to backbone. Class, mammalia or mammals is a form or class, as opposed to, say, reptiles or birds or fish. Then you move from class to order. Here you have carnivora, and we've talked about that already. That means meat eaters. There are also classes that include the herbivora, omnivora. Then family, and that's where you move from, say, canines versus bears. And so Ursidae is the family of bears. Canines would be the family of dogs. And then genus, which is the subclass from family, and then finally species. And once you get to the species name, you are down to one single species that we would be talking about. And that leads to a very important question, which we'll answer after we talk about this. What is the difference between a prokaryote and a eukaryote? Even before we talk about animals versus plants, we have to talk about this difference. And on the left here, you see an example of a eukaryote, and on the right, you see examples of a prokaryote. Before we can talk about prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, we have to understand something known as an organelle. An organelle is a structure within the cell that performs a specific task. On the left, the eukaryotes have organelles, and you can see that there's mitochondrion and the nucleolus and the nucleus that are labeled, and we'll talk about this in more detail next week. But these are known as organelles. The mitochondrion is a structure that's responsible for producing energy. The nucleus is a structure that's responsible for producing RNA. The nucleus is the structure that's responsible for DNA replication and the production of proteins, etc. So these are all organelles. On the prokaryotic side, except for the ribosome, there are no real membrane-bound organelles. You have a nucleoid type, but there's no membrane there. It's just where the DNA happens to gather, and there's areas throughout the cell where many of these functions occur. So a prokaryotic cell has no distinct membrane-bound organelles, whereas a eukaryotic cell has distinct membrane-bound organelles. And so organisms that have cells that look like the ones on the left are called eukaryotic cells, and cells that have organisms that look like the right here are prokaryotic organisms. Now, prokaryotes are almost entirely single-cell organisms, and then eukaryotes are everything else. And so both animals and plants generally come under the idea of eukaryote, which is why some people talk about a 3 or 5 kingdom system. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail in class. Now, as I said, we were going to answer a question, and is, what is a species? You know, once you get down to that last category, how do you know that there isn't further subdivisions? And this is actually not as simple a question to answer as you would think. But one very popular definition, and the definition that I'll expect you to understand, is a unit of one or more populations of individuals, and this is the important part, that can reproduce under normal circumstances, that their children, the product of their reproduction, is fertile offspring, and that those offspring are isolated, reproductively isolated from other different units. So what that means is that horses beget horses that beget other horses. One example of where the species definition was important was horses can produce offspring with donkeys. The combination of a horse and a donkey is called a mule. But mules are reproductively infertile. Species do not cross-pollinate, for lack of a better word. They can form hybrids, and we'll talk about what a hybrid is. If you look at the top here, the biological concept of a species is defined as populations of individuals that can produce viable offspring that can produce other viable offspring. And morphologically, the classification of species based on certain morphologic criteria. That is, morphologic criteria are things like whether they have a trunk or not, you know, whether they have flat ears, whether they have scales, whether they have hair, whether they have mammary glands, etc. And this definition, the morphologic concept of species, can be confusing because there are many animals or plants that look very similar morphologically but cannot fit biologically reproduce. And the example of a mule is an excellent example. Morphologically, a mule is different, but not dramatically different from either a horse or a donkey. So, how does one go about classifying? You know, it would be incredibly difficult if we just tried to memorize all the classification system and tried to memorize where everybody fit in. Now you can memorize the 7 levels like I'm having you do, and that works. But the best way is to develop something known as biological keys. Now, what a biological key is the characteristics of an organism that can be used to separate them as you go down through those levels. So as you start with kingdom, there's a characteristic that separates one kingdom from another. And then you go to phylum, and then there is a characteristic that separates different phyla. And then you go down to the next and to the next. And these are generally yes-no questions. So for example, the first question might be dry skin, yes versus no. If it's no, then you're up with the salamander. If it's yes, then the question is, does it have hair? Yes versus no. Does it have opposable thumbs, and so forth. Now I'm going to go through a specific example of biological keys in just a minute. Matter of fact, I'm going to do it right now. If you look on page 21 to 23 in your textbook, you see a series of questions that represent the one example of biological keys. And what you notice is that when you give certain answers, you're referred to another question. If you give some answers, it'll tell you what the phylum is or what the class is. And if you're not referred to another question, frequently what you're supposed to do is go to the next question. So let's just give it an example here, give it a try, and we'll start with this organism that's pictured here. Now, you guys know what this looks like, but let's go through the whole thing just so you get an understanding. And one of your homework assignments is to do 5 or 6 of these that they give you in the book. So let's take a look. The first, and I might give you something like this on a quiz. I haven't decided if I'm going to do that or not. So the first question on page 21 is this a microscopic organism or is it a macroscopic organism? Now, obviously what that means is, can you see it without a microscope? And yes, we can see, unless this is a microscopic picture, which it's not, we can see it. And so we go to question 3. If you read question 3, it says, is this an autotroph? That is, does it get its energy without eating other things? Or heterotroph? That is, does it have to eat? Well, most of these types of animals, this one for sure has to eat, so it's a heterotroph. So you go to question 5. And question 5 says, well, heterotrophs are divided into consumers or decomposers. So is this like the slime on the bottom of the ocean that decomposes things? Is it like a buzzard that eats dead animals? And the answer is no. It's a consumer. It eats live things. And so you go to question 6. Question 6 says, does this have a backbone? You may or may not know this, but this animal does have a backbone. The answer is yes. You're referred to another question, but now you know you've gone down. You've gone from kingdom Animalia, which I probably should have put after I said it was heterotrophic, because almost all heterotrophs, almost all consumers, are animals, so Animalia would be there. And then it has a backbone, so it's in the phylum of Chordata. Okay, so we've moved down to 2 classifications. Does it have a jaw or beak? Yes. So it goes to 23. 23 says, does it have scales? No. Goes to 26. Mouth on the lower part of the body or on the front? This is one of those where it's on the front. If it's on the lower part of the body, it would be right in this area right here. And so this is on the front. And so because of that answer, we can go to the next set, which is classification, whatever that word is. I don't know how to say that word. Does it have skin? No. Does it have skin? No hair. And is it slimy? No. So you go to 28. Does it have feathers? Yes. Because it has feathers, it's in the class now of aves. Okay? And so we know that we've gotten all the way down to class based on the answers. I think that this class, Ornithocythes or whatever it is, might need to have been order instead of class. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, this is how you go through this. And whether I got all these answers right or not is not as important as understanding the process that you do to use the biological keys. So I want you to try to do this, and if you don't fully understand or can't work through the ones in the book on experiment 1.1, bring that to class next or this week, and we'll go through a couple of those in class as well. The last slide here is how we go about naming. Okay, and as we talk about naming, generally animals and plants are named in a specific way. First of all, what we've been doing is called taxonomy. And taxonomy is the science of naming organisms. And when we name organisms, we name them in a process known as binomial nomenclature. And this is a process where you use the genus and the species name to name the organism. Now, you'll notice there's a couple of things I just want to point out, and then we'll be done with the lectures for this part and for the first week. The first is I actually made a mistake on the Homo sapiens, because the genus name is always supposed to be capitalized. It's always capital Homo, lowercase sapien, okay? And so you see here you have Quercus rubra and Quercus alba. Both of these are oak trees, okay? So Quercus is the genus for all oak trees, and then rubra is the species, red versus white. Homo sapien, there's also something called Homo erectus and Homo some other stuff, which are putatively somehow related to us. That goes into an argument about evolution that I don't want to talk about at this point. The other thing I'll point out is it's very common to just put a capital Q period rubra, or a capital Q period alba, or a capital H period sapiens when referring to the name of a various organism. So try to work through your homework and come to class ready to discuss these various things that we've gone over in these first three parts. And I'm hoping that you'll enjoy the time we've spent together. Thank you very much.